All right. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the opening celebration of the late works, Clyfford Still in Maryland. My name is Nicole Cromartie, and I'm the Director of Education and Programs here at the Clyfford Still Museum. Tonight, we have a very small in-gallery audience and over 100 people joining us virtually tonight. Thank you so much for being here. This evening, we'll be celebrating both the opening of Late Works Clyfford Still in Maryland and Dean Sobel, who will be stepping down as CSM Director for a position at the University of Denver. This will be his final public program as Director of the museum. As many of you already know, Dean Sobel is the founding director of the Clyfford Still Museum, joining the project in 2005. If you haven't had a chance to send Dean your well wishes, you can add them at the link in the chat and he will see that Padlet. So now I'm going to pass it over to Dean. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I will turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes. At least I can hear me here. We're going to assume it's going well elsewhere. I'm really glad that we can do this at all, and certainly being in the galleries is always a treat. So I'm delighted that we're here at the museum this evening. I want to dedicate my lecture tonight to two groups of people, the first being the artist's daughters, Diane Still Knox and Sandra Still Campbell. And I'd also like to dedicate this, my remarks to the entire Clyfford Still Museum staff in the broadest definition of that term, including our wonderful security crew who soldiered through with me through the extraordinary last 6 months. As I think you know, our new exhibition, which opens tomorrow and runs through mid-February, highlights the works of art that Clyfford Still produced after his move to Maryland in 1981. The date range for Still's Maryland period is from age 56 to 75. It was a very productive period. He completed roughly 380 paintings and 1,100 drawings. This is a show that I've wanted to do since the very beginnings, probably before I'd even seen many early works. Projects like these are part of the common taxonomy art historians use to categorize, break down, draw circles around an artist's body of work. We've actually done it a lot here. We just closed an exhibition called The Early Works, which was coincidental that they were butted up against one another. And we also have done certain time-based themes such as the war years and the San Francisco years. The exhibition and its accompanying publication propose, first, that there is in fact a thing that you and I can call late work. As with most great artists that live a long time, in the case of Clyfford Still, there is a distinct production, his late work, that lives comfortably within his creative practice. The exhibition and publication attempt to show how these works differ from his high abstract expressionist period of roughly 1942 to 1960, the work for which he is best known. But most importantly, our hope is to reveal a little known but large body of work that is, makes Still, I think, a far richer and more complex artist than we previously understood. Since so few works from the Maryland period made it out of the studio during his lifetime or were available for general viewing, our inaugural exhibition only had one gallery of them. A full-scale presentation of these works, I think, is especially meaningful. Finally, as the museum reaches its 10th year, we are in a position to present little-known masterworks, roads not taken, and examples that underscore particular painting problems that Still was trying to solve. Given that our collection arrived at the museum en masse in 2011 and 2012, unstretched, and in the case of drawings, unmatted, sufficient access to the Maryland works has only been possible in the last few years. This exhibition therefore represents the culmination of an enormous project in which nearly all of Still's late works were unrolled, cataloged, and stretched for the first time. Very few museum professionals get to be part of such an extraordinary effort, and it's been a lot of fun. I want to acknowledge the contributions of the museum's curatorial and conservation team that have been part of this memorable effort. David Anfam, Emily Kozakowski, Michael Meixel, Bailey Plotchek, Barbara Ramsey, Pam Skiles, James Squires, and more recently, Britt Scholnick. Since most of these individuals have been involved with the museum from its beginnings, their work forms not only the DNA of this exhibition, but of the museum as a whole. In my experience, creativity at the level at which Still operated has a spark, a trajectory, but also a plateau, and in some cases a decline. For most, it's a journey of peaks and valleys. This certainly applies to other art forms as well, one that I'm particularly interested in, popular music. During COVID, Bob Dylan released a new album at the age of 79 that many believe is among his best work. David Bowie, after a dreary run of albums in the 80s and 90s and a full 10 years out of the spotlight, recorded 2 great records in the last 2 years after just before his death, The Next Day and Black Star. Of course, not all great artists live long enough to enjoy or battle through a late career. Raphael, Caravaggio, and Van Gogh died before age 40. This is particularly unfortunate, especially for them, since certain artists' late work is often singled out as being their most inventive and forward-looking. I think of Michelangelo, who realized his late Last Judgment at the back of the Sistine Chapel, which was made during his 60s. More recently, there's been late great works by people like Monet and Matisse, Marcel Duchamp and Jasper Johns, Martin Puryear, who at age 80 represented the United States at the Venice Biennale last year with a very vital body of new work, and Carmen Herrera, still alive at age 105, who had a Whitney Museum retrospective at the age of 100, though this survey ended with work made only during her mid-80s. For a variety of reasons, the abstract expressionists were a short-lived bunch. Arshile Gorky and Jackson Pollock died at age 44, which incidentally is about the same age that Chadwick Boseman died. So when you think about the loss we felt with that, actors passing, think of how it felt to have an artist who looked a lot older actually dying at that part of his career. I was reminded of that drawing these dates together. The late work of, and Franz Klein and David Smith and Ad Reinhardt all passed in their 50s. The late work of the long-living abstract expressionists, Willem de Kooning and Philip Guston, who we'll look at in a few minutes, has been especially celebrated. Along with Lee Krasner and Robert Motherwell, Still ended up being the longest living of the major artists from the first generation of ABEX. But as the final survivors of this vanguard movement, and arguably of modernism as a whole, these remaining few undoubtedly bore a certain amount of weight. Still's late paintings were produced at a time when abstract expressionism and painting itself was being rigorously reevaluated, disregarded, and proclaimed dead. In 1975, the editors of Artforum stressed those understood to be making the next inevitable step now work with any material but paint. That, of course, was not true, but it framed a narrative that furthered certain artists and movements over certain others. By the mid-1970s, Guston, here shown on the top left with his late work, had already abandoned abstraction entirely in favor of a figurative expressionism. Many other artists were depicting new concepts and processes that moved well beyond painting, which in turn raised questions about the relevance of the entire ABEX generation. Those that continued on with painting, such as Guston, Frank Stella, and Andy Warhol, made paintings that intentionally didn't look like abstract expressionism. Stella's orderly bands of paint insisted what you see is what you see, meaning that paintings were not images of some sublime universe, they were matters of fact. Warhol said, I wanted to paint what the abstract expressionists refused to acknowledge. Interestingly, ABEX found its best footing in the 1970s among a group of Black abstractionists like Alma Thomas, Jack Whitten, Ed Clark, and the more senior Norman Lewis. So that's some of the context that begins our story, when in the fall of 1960, Clyfford Still and his wife Patricia drove south from New York City in search of their next home. After his distinguished rise to prominence during the first half of the 1950s, the heyday of abstract expressionism, the balance of that decade was marked by Still's effort to remove himself from the nexus of critics, dealers, curators, and copycat artists whom he helped launch. As he had put it, I had become something of a conscience. I had no real desire for the role. Given his committed independence and stature, Still could have based himself anywhere. According to Still's daughter, Sandra, the Still set out in search of a locale similar to the environs he remembered fondly from the time spent in Richmond, Virginia, between 1943 and 1945. About 4 hours from New York and roughly halfway to Virginia, they came upon the rolling hills and horse stables of Carroll County, Maryland. This was all the farther they needed to go. The next day, they bought a farmhouse in Westminster, an hour northwest of Baltimore, which became their residence in mid-1961. It included 27 acres of land to provide a sufficient buffer from the outside world. In 1966, they moved to this brick home in New Windsor, 7 miles west, which would be their final home. Carroll County's plentiful farmland and open sky, Marylanders call it horse country, which he never would have been able to enjoy in San Francisco or New York, where he had previously lived, might have reminded Still of the environs of his youth and early adulthood in eastern Washington state and Alberta, Canada. The Westminster homestead included a corn barn, which Still used as a studio, including after the Westminster move, until he stopped painting in 1979. It would unfortunately was razed in the 1980s. The barn required substantial improvements to become a suitable workspace, and his creative output was understandably slow. His inventory of paintings lists only one painting made in Maryland in 1961. But other matters may have also affected Still's production. Betty Freeman, in her unpublished book on Still, generated from unprecedented access to the artist, claimed Still was at a low point in the early 1960s. Quoting Freeman, he said that he felt he was already a part of history and was a dead man now. Another important consideration is Still had also remarked to Freeman, I had taken the densely worked paintings as far as I could go, and I felt I was coming up a dead-end wall of abstraction, manipulation, and device. But this time, by early 1961, he seems to have settled in. Writing to the painter Ernest Briggs, Still revealed a refreshed state of mind. My setup here has arrived at a point which permits me to relax a bit. The isolation has proved reinvigorating. The fresh air has strengthened the spirit and cleared away tensions that never should have been born. Indeed, Still's production increased with 18 paintings in 1962, and his art began again. As is often the case with artists as they progress, characteristics of earlier work become synthesized or even abandoned in favor of ideas presented in simpler, more economical terms. Among the abstract expressionists, this can be detected in de Kooning's late ribbon paintings, Robert Motherwell's minimalist open series, and even Mark Rothko's taut, simplified rectangles done only in dark tones near the end of his life in the 1960s. Still's late work can likewise be considered in this way. Beginning in 1963, Still drastically reduced the number of forms in his work, creating about 30 works on canvas that feature just a few patches of paint, thereby exposing large swaths of bare canvas. A noteworthy example of these early 1960s works is the way in which Still realigned his conceptions of space and composition. Nearly all of these paintings, and they extend into 1964, explore very basic figure-ground relationships and the relationships of these patches to each other. The forms appear to hover and slightly rise to the front of the picture plane, stressing the flattened painting space that characterizes Still's paintings, those of the other abstract expressionists, and nearly all avant-garde post-Greenbergian painting of the 1960s. In toto, these so-called splotch works are a departure from the prototypical heavily encrusted, tightly wound, multi-form paintings of the 1940s and 50s, and may not even fall within traditional definitions of abstract expressionism. Importantly, these paintings represent a new start, what in acting is called going to zero, a helpful step before moving toward more expressive compositions that defined his work from the 1960s and 70s. This would be a very good point to lay out some of the traits of this so-called late style. Particularly discernible in Still's late work is the broadening as well as lightening of his palette. While his classic abstract expressionist canvases favored blacks, dark reds, deep blues, and bright yellows, his late works elevated certain colors generally used as accents in earlier paintings, if used at all. This includes purple, seen especially here, a monumental painting that is making its debut in this exhibition, but also green, white, often large billowing fields of white, and even salmon pink, seen here, one of the first mural scale paintings he made in Maryland. Its related drawing from 1962 is included in the exhibition. Browns and other so-called earth tones, siennas, umbers, both burnt and raw, rose in prominence during this time, and particularly his use of the color ochre, a neutral clay pigment that implants a weathered coarseness and earthiness to many of his late canvases. This color has connections to the hues of the farm subjects still painted in Pullman, Washington during the 1930s, and in fact, his daughter Sandra argued he always went back to his roots in colors, the earthen colors and the ochres. Still's interest in more expansive and expressive compositions is revealed in a single canvas begun in 1963 and revisited in 1966, PH 389. This work began in 1963 and was based on a pastel drawing made in the late 1950s, seen here at the left of this slide. On the right is the very first state, which we were able to find from a slide in our archives. The first state was extensively reworked in 1966 to replace previous bare areas with enormous fields of ochre, maroon, and black. The floating color of the earlier state was eliminated by mooring the composition to a black columnar form on the left and a field of ochre at the center and right, both of which tie the previous composition to the bottom and right edges. Perhaps most striking about this work is the way in which on the right side, the painting starts to swirl clockwise, throwing the verticality that marks some of Still's 1950s works off kilter. A new dynamism is entering his image bank. This dynamism, in which in some sort of implied movement or mysterious force appears to have entered into his picture vocabulary, can be seen in the last years of his New York period, such as the picture on the left from 1960. But also a painting that you'll see in the Maryland period on the right. It's also interesting to compare a picture I just showed you, or similar, one of the splotch paintings, with this other Maryland work to see how versatile he was in making more static compositions and these more dynamic paintings such as PH 432. This new direction in diagonals can be somewhat startling in that Still's customary solid columnar forms seem to tumble over as if by these invisible forces. In PH 931, and in many paintings of this period in 1973 and 1974, virtually everything has become exaggerated and expressive. It's like we're looking at some cataclysmic collision of forces. In others, such as the more medium-sized PH 1034, Still presents interlocking twisting forms that suggest a vortex. Some works can be a bit more relaxed, including PH 1093 from the 1970s, which exhibits a movement from bottom to top, like rising flames or tinder, and some that are more fluttery. It's at the time in the mid-1960s where he starts to develop a range of new formats and structures. I'm not going to say much about any of these pictures, but I just wanted to introduce these images, which are in some ways kind of startling. Some of them have precedence in the earlier work, such as these two that seem to rely on a more horizontal format. This pair represents a reworking of the blues and the blacks, for which he's so well known. And here's another pair of mostly black and white paintings, one from 1954 and the other from 1973. The earlier painting is characterized by its stasis. If it exhibits movement, it's glacial in speed. The late work is activated, it flutters, maybe even roars a little. PH 929 is a powerful example of what we would call Still's late style. We actually love this painting. I think it's one of the best Maryland paintings of all. It looks great with others of the time period. And I never miss an opportunity to show it going head to head with Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm at the Metropolitan Museum when both paintings were shown very briefly side by side. Other new approaches emerged in Maryland. In 1973, for the first and last time, Still used latex house paint in 6 medium-sized works, another exploration of different surface sheens and effects. The wispy soft edges of PH 898 on the left, or 899, sorry, are uncharacteristic for this artist and appear to be the result of his use of a traditional 2-inch artist brush as opposed to his customary palette knife as a means to dematerialize the form. For a group of large paintings made that same year in 1973, Still principally used a roller brush, such as in this yellow painting on the right, to create enormous color fields, giving these works a thinner surface, and interestingly ties him, albeit briefly, to the soap stain artists such as Helen Frankenthaler and Morris Louis. I start to see some of the new formats actually coming out of the drawings, such as PP 970 and others from this period. In this group of works, he introduces a new method of mark making. In the painting itself, we believe he used paint directly from the tube, possibly using his finger or a very small palette knife to create a highly activated, overlapping, and oftentimes frenetic constellation of banded color. There's a better detail of exactly what I was talking about. Still worked in pastel throughout his life. He made around 1,100 drawings in the 1970s, usually on various colored dime store construction papers, sometimes over multi-day sessions in the New Windsor home where he had a drawing studio, used mostly when weather or later energy discouraged the 15-minute drive to the Westminster painting studio. Here's another interesting and distinct compositional format that he invented in Maryland that I believe unites paper and canvas. The appearance of terse, sprightly vertical lines, such as those in this work and others like it, are distinct from the more expressive serpentine lifelines of Still's abstract expressionist period. The relationship between Still's paintings and drawings is even more wedded when we consider that commercially available construction paper is the same proportion as many of his late canvases. A 12 by 18 inch sheet and its 2:3 ratio led to several canvases that measure around 114 by 172 inches, that same 2:3 ratio. Many of Still's grand late canvases have the effect of drawings wrote large. This drawing-like quality remains into his last years. They present a quickness and a touch that represents his pastel marks, only here they seem to be scattered around in yellow paint toward the upper and top corners. In many later works, the hushed, bare canvas backgrounds create exciting compositional possibilities that in ways unite these very late works with the so-called splotch works that first appear in the exhibition. Two major developments occur in the 1977-1978 period. First of all, plans for a major retrospective are underway for the exhibition at the Met that will appear in 1979, which was a major achievement then and still is for any living artist. But unfortunately, his suffering from digestive problems leads to a diagnosis of colon cancer. Archival documents reveal that he seems to begin an extended period of reconnecting with figures consequential to his life and career. People such as musicologist Earl Blue, who introduced him to Rothko in 1943, Murray Bundy, the eminent scholar and thesis advisor for Still at Washington State, and curator Catherine Koo, who authored text on Still. In January 1979, in a letter to Blue, Still stated, "I have just completed 3 paintings that I consider the most interesting and significant that I ever made." This is PH 90, one of the works that he was referring to, which, by the way, you may know he dedicated and gave to his wife, Patricia, as a Christmas present that year. However, Still's production slowed considerably, particularly with paintings. Only 4 canvases are recorded in his inventory between May and August 1st, 1979, the date of his last painting, PH 1098. Works on paper continued until January 1980, when he underwent surgery to remove a malignant tumor. As an extensive period of healing followed, he never actually fully recovered. Still died at a hospital in Baltimore on June 23rd, 1980, at the age of 75. As much as one can look at Still's last works and search for the awareness that the end was near, the downward angle of previously upright lifelines, the near evaporation of marks that many of his paintings and drawings exhibit, and even the preponderance of black construction paper in his very last works of art, it's unlikely that Still used his art as an analog for his life. He once wrote, "My painting is a life statement, not an autobiography." Like great artists before him and those since, Still's primary objective was to create a monumental art that wasn't connected to a time or a place, but was rather an extension of the maker's character and strength and purpose. On this level, he most certainly succeeded. In the summer of 1969, roughly midway through his Maryland period, Still recorded a poignant expression. Following a lengthy text that memorialized his characteristic anger about a critic's response to an art, Still revealed what I think was the true state of mind that marked his time in Maryland. He said, I quote, "I set down these reflections to clear the mind and to enable me to look out again on the green of the trees and the grasses, the clarity of the almost cloudless sky, to feel the refreshing wind and the delightful snack with Pat on the porch. It is a brilliant and beautiful day, typically of Maryland at its best." Thank you.
So before we take our first question, we did have a clarification from Sandra Still Campbell, Clyfford Still's daughter, who's joining us tonight.
Not surprising.
Maybe the last one you'll get from her. So she says, not a question. Clifford, Patricia, and Sandra set out for Maryland early July 1961.
There you go. She would know. I stand corrected.
And then we do have one question. It was interesting to hear Dean say that this show offers examples of Still's roads not taken. Do you show the splotch paintings and the frenetic energy paintings in order to show roads not taken, or was there anything else you were thinking of?
You know, curating and exhibitions are just sort of one version of the story, like art history and all histories. And this was a particularly difficult project in some respects because it's such a large body of work, 375 paintings. But I think what I've tried to do is at least lay out a particular version of that story with the hope that others will revise it and add new meaning as the museum continues along. But I think what's most interesting about this exercise for me, and I think in many ways it was to be able to look at it chronologically. We have virtually all of the late work here. And again, to try to draw a circle around certain aspects that define that period. The roads not taken are always things that happen that would probably dispute a lot of what I said. A single painting you could show next to those splotch works and say, well, they weren't all these minimalist, reductive works. But I think it's one way of considering, especially at the very beginning of his career, this question all artists must face when they walk into the studio is, you know, what am I going to do today? What do I do next? So I think that's probably the most interesting question to me when looking at these late works, is how we answered that question.
So we have another question. This is from Phyllis. Her question is, are there more landscape colors in the paintings from Maryland than New York?
Maybe, you know, greens, probably not purple or pinks, but I mean, I think those colors, greens, in some respects, they're more used in more representational works. But, you know, we certainly see green, but never the interest that we see in the late works where they become large and very much a part of your focus. So I think there is something where those colors were available to him, and in the late work he had probably any number of reasons to want to try them out. But green is we were talking about this earlier, green is a very, very difficult color to pull off, and one that you don't see so often in abstraction, or at least historical abstraction.
And a question from Nicholas. He says, beautiful lecture and best wishes to Dean Sobel. Is the timing of the major gift to the Albright Knox in 1964 coincidental with his move and late period?
Probably. The question pertains to Still giving 31 paintings to the Albright Knox Art Gallery in 1964. I think the show was in 66. And it must have something to do with wanting to, one, you know, get rid of some of this work. I don't think artists need to have it surrounding them at all times. But it was this attempt to start to try out the notion of what we have here in Denver, to see what it's like to have an institution care for and present and interpret a large body of work. And I've always thought of the Buffalo project as a kind of warm-up, because the San Francisco Museum was also a beneficiary about 10 years later. And by that time, the will had already been drafted. So I think it was something that had been in his mind during the whole Maryland period. And having worked with enough artists, I think there's always that question of what do you do with all this stuff when you're gone? And often it goes to dealers or it goes into storage. But it was pretty important for Still, I think, to see it all in the museum that some of us are in today.
I'm getting a little distracted by all the love that's coming through in the chat. There's so much congratulations and yeah, love coming in the chat. So our next question is, what was the most illuminating or surprising thing you discovered in putting this exhibition together?
Probably the first gallery, those splotch paintings. You know, we unrolled most of the paintings out of order. They were done in various strategic ways, but sometimes out of convenience. And so if you see one of those splotch works with just a big, one of my colleagues called it looked like a fried egg. You don't know what to make of that. You don't think of it as a major work. And that's what my point was. It was something I wanted to do, but I couldn't get my head around what a late work was. And once you start to look at those pictures in person and you start to see them together, that was probably the most, and in a way, sort of a confessional that I think I was wrong about those paintings when I first saw them, and now I'm really quite fond of those paintings. I hope you come in, most of you are online, I hope you come and see them in person because they really don't look like much on screen. But when you see them in relationship to you and your scale and your body and the way in which Still lays down that paint, they're really, really wonderful, I think, great paintings. So you need to, like Still said, you really need to spend some time with the work. You can't do this in a matter of weeks or months. You need 15 years to draw some conclusions, I guess. At least I did.
Dean, did the late works take on a new meaning for you as you decided to depart and for this to be your final exhibition?
That's funny. I'm not a particularly creative person, so I don't have those same needs to reinvent or to, sustain something of that caliber, where by the age of, 50 or 55, they knew they had written themselves into history. It was something that was plainly apparent by the amount of public fascination with these artists. And I think that messes with you. I think that's a difficult thing to process when you get that kind of adulation, and especially being a creative person. I think that's what I appreciated about being a curator, is I didn't have to go through it myself. I can articulate it and detect it in other people's struggle.
This one is from Amy Knox. She says,
Hi,
Dean, thank you for all of your terrific leadership over the years. It was a joy to work with you on the board. What will you miss the most in leaving this position?
Well, I've said this to a few people. What I'll miss the most is coming to the museum and not being able to move them around. Because that's what curators like to do. We like to create rooms of works of art. Yeah, that'll be hard. And the security officers will have to work especially hard. I'd keep an eye on me when I come in. Yeah. Seriously though, that's the hardest part. It used to feel like, I had a certain privilege to do that, but I will lose that privilege in a matter of days.
Okay, we're going to take a question from the in-person audience. I'm going to pass.
Dean, as one of the founding board members, along with Chris Hunt and Sandra Still, you have done a magnificent job creating this museum. And, I can't imagine Still seeing a better museum for his work. Were he to be here, he would be thrilled.
Thank you, Kurt. And for those on the Zoom and YouTube portion, that was Dr. Kurt Fried, who was Patricia Still's nephew, and was the person who first got the spark going here in Denver. And there's a small number of us, Chris Hunt, my board member. I don't want my board president for 15 years. I don't want to start listing names because I will leave out so many people. But there was something really like a kind of perfect storm of where Denver was and where the art community was in Denver at that time. That made this possible. And it certainly was a lot of people, and especially those people at the front end of the project. Everyone was valuable, everyone I worked with, everyone I came in contact with, but there was something, a certain, band of us trying to prove the importance of this project, and it finally came to fruition 6 years later. So thank you for that, Kurt. I appreciate it.
Can you do a couple more, Dean? There's just so
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Okay, this is from someone who shares your last name. Says, hi, Michael. 5-paragraph essay on Dean's favorite piece of the Maryland years. Go.
Say in 5 seconds?
5 paragraphs.
Oh, 5 paragraphs? What are my favorite? I mean, I think this one behind me, I made the point of it. You know, this painting has been out a lot. If you want to show the late work, this is a pretty good example of it. 1049, a painting that's almost always been the last painting you see when you would be right up there. But I think Michael just wants to see me squirm a little bit. So.
Okay. We have a question from the Kirkland Museum team. This is a tough one, Dean. From a conservation standpoint, can you discuss the condition of the works with latex paint versus oil? Do you see one medium preserved better than the other?
I wouldn't be the one to be able to answer that. Our conservation team would. And we haven't shown those latex works very much. I actually, it's interesting someone's asking about that because we added 2 walls for this exhibition just to allow more content in the exhibition. But some of those latex works, which are very interesting paintings because of the materials being used and some of the imagery, were cut sort of at the very end of the selection. So I wish I could have a better understanding of those. But that'll be, there's a lot of work still to be done here, and those latex works I think should get their chance to run around the field a little bit in the galleries. It's a good question. And we don't even know, I don't know personally why. It could have been what he had around. It could have been, woke up that day and just felt he wanted to try something different. But it is unusual and a very short, brief moment when he decided to use that paint.
Question from Joseph. I'm struck by how rugged and modern his work generally remained during this time, even aggressive. But from the outside, it didn't generally appear that his life was like that. What do you think his work ultimately says about the man?
That quote about, art being, not an autobiography. I think that's a difficult, again, not being a creative person, and inevitably certain things you experience or certain sensations, even in his natural environment may have had some effect. I think a lot of the abstract expressionists were not uninterested in landscape and the forces of the universe, but I don't know that Still was thinking in those terms, or I would tell you he probably wasn't. I think it was a very isolated world, living in a barn studio almost every day of his life, and I think what comes out of the studio is a reflection of the art and not the life.
All right, I think that'll be a good place to close. Thank you,
I think it's a great place to close. Thank you, everybody.
All right, and now it's time to celebrate. So we are going to kick off the reception portion of this program. So everyone grab your drinks at home and here in the gallery, just keep your masks on. We are going to start the reception with a special video tribute toast from Sandra Still Campbell, Clyfford Still's daughter.
Hey, Dean. I get my 2 minutes to say something that covers 15 years. You're asking an awful lot. But I thought, well, what would Dad have said, Clyfford? And start at the beginning. So your beginning and Diane's and my beginning and our 2 spouses was when we were finally able to access the artwork at Artex in Maryland and to let you finally see the real deal. And it was a joy for us and an experience for us. We have never really handled Dad's paintings. We helped him move things, helped him roll things sometimes, but to really have you look at them and respond, to see how ahead of his time he was, and you got it right away. You just got that this is authentic, and it was like we just couldn't wait long enough to get to the next one and the next canvas and expose to you what we had seen and witnessed during our lifetime and knowing what was in store for you. We were very aware, how can you build a building if you don't know what you're getting? Color slides, we didn't even have access to them in the beginning. So your patience, your excitement carried us through a lot of painful moments too, because we were adapting to being without them. And we were like little lionesses trying to protect the great king of this field. So you were super patient, and I'm so grateful for that. You put up with a lot of my emotion, but we are emotional, and Dad was too. Art was important to him. For him, it was life or death. And congratulations, you did it. We got the right architect, the right staff. They're amazing. And I think Diane and I can just roll over and let go. The day I knew, all those years, when you and David and Fam were planning the inaugural exhibit, is the day that the art people at Artex unrolled. And I've got the date here, so I'll know. 1977, PH 1049, and that's the big monster that's bare canvas and the yellow slashes that you had in the inaugural exhibit. And I'll never forget that, because it totally assured me that you and David got it. You got on this moving stairwell ladder. It rolls around, so you're going up a stairway, and each of you took your turns going up. The painting is so long that some of the staff had to hold the ends up to make it as flat as possible, and you had to get above the painting and scan it. You could have heard a pin drop. Everybody was just breathless and stunned by what you were seeing, and that was so gratifying for me. And then as we left them to roll it up, you and David walked down one of those long corridors at Artex, and I was behind you by about 15, 20 feet, but you two looked at each other, shaking your heads, and said to each other, "Who knew? My God, who knew?" And the rest has been a lot easier for me by watching your spontaneous reactions to the artwork. I wish you well in what you're going to do next. You set the bar very high for the next directors. I'm so grateful. Good luck.
Okay, so if it wasn't totally clear to everyone, this man is going to be really missed. What wonderful, warm words to honor someone who has done so much. Thank you so much to everyone for sharing your memories of Dean. And thank you to everyone watching online and celebrating Dean Sobel and the opening of the Late Works.